Hello, my name is Tim Shoebridge. This video is going to be a walkthrough of my CV expander that works with the Dreadbox NYMPHES in conjunction with my MIDI controller, which is called NymphCV. What I'm going to do basically in this video is walk you through the expander, tell you what it does and how to use it, which is absolutely fine. But I'm also going to try and explain the three main reasons why I ended up developing this expander module, so you can get an idea of the kind of things you can do with it that you can't do with any standard MIDI controller, whether it's software or hardware. So that is what's coming up in this video. I hope it's of interest to you. As always, thanks very, very much for watching. In terms of the global modulations that you can do with the NymphCV, that's LFO2, mod wheel, velocity and aftertouch. Three of those modulations are only ever positive. In fact, all the modulations can only be applied in a positive manner. And I think that's due to the fact that there is this MIDI-CC automation capability inside the NymphCV. I think that's why it's there. But if you see on the screen here, you know, when you're applying a modulation, it's only a positive modulation that you're able to do. You can't do a negative modulation. Now, it's possible maybe that Dreadbox could address this and you know, provide an enhancement in a future firmware upgrade. But I'm wondering what they would do, because at the end of the day, these modulations are all automatable via MIDI, and MIDI doesn't support negative values. It only supports positive values from 0 to 127. So how would you perform a negative modulation of one of these global mod sources? I don't know. Now LFO number 2, well, LFO number 2 is a bipolar modulation. You know, it's undulating between going above 0 and below 0. So you do get negative modulations by the fact that it is an LFO. But with the mod wheel, velocity and aftertouch, they can only affect these synth parameters in a positive way. So what I mean by that is, you know, if we turn the cutoff down and we select mod wheel and then we add some modulation to it, then the only thing the mod wheel can do is increase the cutoff. It can't ever decrease the cutoff. Same with velocity, it can only ever increase the cutoff or increase the resonance, or increase the decay or increase the release. It can't ever do the opposite, and I think that is a bit of a limitation. So that's when I started to look at sort of like doing something in inside Voltage Modular that would allow me to kind of, you know, as cleverly as I could, do negative modulations of these values, and that's what I'm going to show you now. So I'm going to go to the library. And here is the sort of expansion module that you need. It's called NymphCV. Let me just drop it into the rack and let's get rid of the library. I'm actually going to have to zoom out slightly to make enough room here, because we're going to be adding some other modules as well. Let's just move it up and put it next to it. Now, the way that you connect up NymphCV to NymphCC is via the MIDI connections. You just basically take a connection from the out to the in, and because that now uses up that in connection, which is sometimes very handy to have, I've provided another one here for you, so you don't lose a MIDI connection by the fact that you have got these two modules linked together. In fact, let me just get rid of this cable for a minute. You actually gain yet another in here, a direct MIDI driver connection here as well, so you actually get more MIDI connectivity if you use these modules together like this. But linked together like this, the way it basically works is that we have a whole load of patch points which are inputs, and you'll see that they're labeled the same as the sliders: wave, level, sub, noise, etc. Wave, level, sub, noise. So all of these sliders here are represented by inputs, and all of the sliders at the top by inputs, and even the reverbs parameters are down here as inputs as well. And I've added a final one here called volume, which is allowing you to modulate the overall volume of your patch, which is going to provide a beautiful tremolo effect, which you can't do otherwise without sort of like, you know, a little tricks and stuff like that. So these patch points are basically giving you a way of applying a virtual control voltage to modulate any of these parameters. We've also got here, which I'll talk about later, CV and gate inputs. So you can actually, rather than using a keyboard or a sequencer via MIDI to play the synth, you could play it using pairs of pitch CV and gate. So we've got 6 of them here, so you could play up to 6 notes of polyphony going on here. And we've got some outputs, and I'll talk about those outputs in a minute. But first of all, let's just modulate NymphCV with a Eurorack module. Now, when I was developing this, in order to help me test it, I actually ended up developing a whole bunch of virtual Eurorack modules, which I will supply as a little bundle for a little bit extra money. I'll supply those, but I'm going to show you here, first of all, something very, very simple. Let's add an LFO, which is not a great example because we already have LFO number 2 for modulating these parameters, but let's just illustrate how it works. So I'm going to take one of the waveforms out of my LFO, like my sine wave, and let's modulate the cutoff. So I'm just going to put my headphones on so I can hear what's going on. So we start off with an initialized patch. Let's bring the cutoff down. Okay, let's do it halfway. And let's just apply our LFO, say the sine wave, to this cutoff patch point here. And when I play, this LFO doesn't go very fast, but it goes very, very, very slow. I won't wait for it to cycle. It sounds quite a brutal kind of modulation that's going on here, because we're actually applying a virtual +5 to -5 volts, which is what's coming out of that patch point there, into our, modulate this signal here. What you would normally do in Eurorack is you would attenuate that signal to bring it down to a more acceptable and better sounding level. So let's do that. I've developed an attenuator, should I say. Here it is. This attenuator it's got 2 attenuators on it. It's a dual attenuator. One circuit there, one circuit there. So let's take this patch point and put it into the attenuator, and then come out of the attenuator and go into the cutoff like that. And now let's hear what that sounds like. There you go. That's far more acceptable. Let's try the sawtooth. You get the idea. But let's come back to this mod wheel issue that I mentioned earlier, the limitation, the fact that the mod wheel can only positively modulate any of these parameters. Let me just show you that without using any of this control voltage stuff going on here. So I've got my cutoff quite low. I'm going to go to mod wheel here as the mod source. I'm going to increase the modulation amount, My mod wheel is down. Let's play a chord and turn it up. It can only ever increase. It can't decrease. So how can I use my CV expander here, NymphCV, to do a negative modulation for me? Now, I need, with this module, to know or to receive the MIDI messages relating to the mod wheel. So this is the sort of the vital thing to understand when using NymphCV expander. At the moment, the keyboard is being directly input into NymphCC, but I actually want to have it input into my module here, which is why I have provided, let's just get rid of this cable a minute, which is why I provided this direct input here. So I'm going to get rid of Nord Wave 2 MIDI in from here. I'm going to add it into here instead. Now it's this CV expander module that's receiving the MIDI. So it's going to be receiving those mod wheel messages as I turn the mod wheel up and down. And what I've done is I've implemented a little MIDI to CV converter inside this module. And I'm exposing down here a bunch of outputs from that MIDI source of data, if you like. Here's the mod wheel. I'm also supplying the velocity, the pitch information, the aftertouch information, pitch bend as well, and trigger and gate. So, and also a single CV out. So you can get all of this stuff, if you like, from the MIDI messages that it's receiving, both through this MIDI socket and through this direct MIDI connection. Let me just sort of like demonstrate that. So here I've got my MIDI output. If I were to apply that directly to the cutoff, it would be, I'm going to turn this down here so we don't get confused as to what is modulating the cutoff. Now, when I play a chord, turn it up, let me just connect it back again. Now when I play a chord, that modulation of from the mod wheel is coming from this cable. If I remove it, nothing happens. Okay, so we have replicated this positive modulation over here. But what I can do is I can negate or invert this signal. I've got another little module that does that. I've got an attenuverter. Let's add that one in. So attenuverters are just like attenuators, but as well as attenuating a signal, they can invert it and then attenuate it. So I'm going to put this down here, and I'm going to take my mod wheel signal, pass it into the attenuverter, take the output from the attenuverter, pass it into the cutoff, and I'm going to go negative with it. So for this to work, I need the cutoff to be quite high to start off with. So play a chord, and as I turn up the mod wheel, cutoff gets turned down. And obviously you can't see me doing this. I'm not cheating. Up, down. So using simple circuits like attenuverters, and by hooking into the MIDI messages coming in from your keyboard or your sequencer or whatever it is, you can invert your modulations and apply them through these patch points to achieve effects that you can't do with the NymphEs on its own. And that's really the driving force behind me actually developing NymphCV in the first place. So as well as the limitation over negative modulations, there's another limitation of the NymphCV that I wanted to try and overcome with this CV expansion module that I've got going on here. And that is, in terms of the modulations themselves that you can do with the NymphCV, you can modulate so many different parameters, but basically you're limited to LFO number 2, really. Yeah, okay, you've got velocity and aftertouch, and those are nice ways of adding expression, and the mod wheel, of course, as well. But wouldn't it be nice to have envelopes modulating some of the parameters? It's quite limited. The amplitude envelope only modulates the amplitude. The filter envelope, actually, there's someone who left a comment the other day, not happy with my use of the word envelope. He wants me to say envelope, which is actually correct, technically correct, but I just can't say envelope. It just sounds a bit weird to me. I'm saying envelope, so I apologize to that person, but it's envelope to me because everyone else says envelope. Envelope. It's an envelope. Anyway, I'm digressing. The filter envelope can modulate the filter, the low-pass filter, and it can also modulate the pitch, but that's it. It can't modulate the cutoff of the high-pass filter, for example. And I think that in terms of modulations, what's kind of missing for me, if I'm going to be critical, is the ability to use envelopes. I'm stuck now. To modulate other things. It would be really, really cool to be able to, increase the noise and subdue it, or the sub oscillator and subdue it, or the waveforms, or the pulse width, or the detune, or the chords, or whatever it is, with an envelope. And you can't do that, but you can do it with CV expansion. So I have developed a little EG, I'm going to call it EG, envelope generator. Here it is. It's added. Oh, very nice. Here we are. Envelope generator. There we are. And so because I'm now sort of like sifting through the MIDI that comes into this module, I can detect when you're playing notes, those note on and note offs. I detect those. So I can generate a trigger value, just like any Eurorack CV MIDI to CV converter can do. I can generate trigger values. We've got a trigger here, which is just a little pulse, and we've got a gate, which is obviously held open for the whole time you hold down a note. And I've got a little switch here, which is called multi, which is multi-trigger on or off. So it'll detect, it'll either trigger and gate every time you play a key, or it'll only trigger for that first one you hold down, and any others it'll ignore. It's got that kind of capabilities built in there. I didn't develop this a long time ago. It's just a couple of days ago, so there might be a few bugs in there, but I mean, hopefully it's going to work for me now. So I can take a gate out from the module, put it into my envelope generator, take the output, and I don't know, let's modulate the sub oscillator level. That would be cool. Headphones back on. Let's see how that works. Okay, so we've just got full sustain at the moment. So whenever I press a key, it's just going to give me full sub. If I drop this cable, no sub, right? So let's put that cable back in, and I'm going to get rid of the sustain and just give it a sort of a stabby decay and a bit of release. Let's try and do that. One way that while I've been developing all this and trying to test it and see that it works, one thing that I ended up developing was a little oscilloscope. Let me add that in there as well. Now, it's a very, very rudimentary scope, and it's quite, seriously heavy on resources. I wouldn't suggest having it running all the time. It sort of eats away at your CPU, it's a little bit buggy as well, I have to say, but it does help me to visualize what's going on here. I'm actually going to take the output from my envelope, put it into the scope. Let's move that over there. And then take its output and then put that into the sub. And hopefully we can see the shape. Okay, we need to crank out a bit. There you go. So multi-trigger is off, so when I hold down 1 and then I press some other notes, they don't do anything. But if I were to turn multi-trigger on, hold down 1, we get that multi-triggering effect. So it all depends on what you're doing, you know, whether you're playing chords, you're playing sort of like a keyboard naturally, or you're doing mono stuff. But playing around with these parameters can really give you some interesting effects. There's a bug there because it's not doing it all the time, I've noticed. So I'm going to fix that before this thing gets released. But you get this, you get the general idea. You can now, you know, with a simple envelope generator module, you can, you know, you can do modulations on any of these parameters here that you couldn't do otherwise. So I think that's it's a nice addition. It sort of extends the capabilities. You know, let's not forget we've got an incredibly cool, great sounding, fantastic sounding, really raw analog. You know, polysynth here behind all this. There's no noise generation going on here. We're not dealing with digital plugins. We're dealing with an analog synth that we're just controlling with MIDI messages, and that's what we're doing. It really works really quite well. However, let me just mention this while I remember to mention this. I need to manage your expectations. Because what we're doing here, it's all great, and it's in sort of like a virtual URAC environment, and you can come up with some really crazy stuff. But remember that what's coming out of this at the end of the day is a MIDI message, or a stream of MIDI messages to the synth. Now, Voltage Modular itself runs at a very high sample rate, 48,000 samples per second. So you can create some really wonderful sounds, very accurate sounding frequency modulations, that kind of things, when you're using you know, sound generating modules inside Voltage Modular itself. However, we are just basically generating MIDI CC messages that will then end up modulating synth parameters inside the NymphCV. And you know, there is a hard limit on how many MIDI messages you can send per second to any device, whether it's from a software controller or a hardware controller. There's a serious limit as to the frequency of those MIDI messages. So you're not going to be able to achieve you know, audio rate modulation at all with this setup. So don't even try it. You're going to get some horrible results. It's going to sound naff, let's face it. It's absolutely fine for envelopes and you know, and really quite fast moving envelopes, stabby kind of sounds, fairly fast moving LFOs, but nothing in the audio rate territory. It's just not going to work sending MIDI messages to a synth. It's just never going to work that way. So this is not a substitute for audio rate modulation whatsoever. I just want to basically, you know, manage your expectations as to what you can do here. Okay, we've nearly reached the end of the video, trust me on this. There's just one more thing to show you regarding the CV expander, and that is this set of patch points here over on the right hand side. Now, you know, as I was sort of building MIDI to CV converter capability into this module to get these outputs from the MIDI, I thought, well, why don't we just go the other way as well? Why can't we supply some pitch CVs and gate signals into this module and drive the NymphCV that way? So I ended up developing a CV to MIDI converter as well, and it supports up to 6 simultaneous note on and offs at the same time, if you like. So it handles 6 voice polyphony if you want to drive it that way. I'm not going to attempt to do that here. It would require too many other modules and a lot of things to set up. I'm actually developing at the moment a little chord sequencer that will play chords in sort of varieties of chords at different steps in a sequence. Once that is ready, I'll do a demo of it. But here I've just got a very, very basic little sequencer which I developed to help me test this module. It's a very simple step sequencer. It's just got 8 steps, and it's got 3 sort of simultaneous tracks or rows to the sequence. The first one here is for generating pitch control voltages. They are quantized, so you move it up and down in semitones, and you've got an octave selector here for it. Then the second row is just a general purpose -5 volts to +5 volts control voltage, which you can set differently on each step, and then, you know, modulate anything you like. And then the third row is a trigger. It's actually a gate that's going to get triggered at each point if you switch these switches on, and then you've got a gate length, so you can set how much of that step is taken up as a gate. It goes from 10% to 90%, so you can get some quite nice sounds out of it. You've got a basic tempo control, and you've got the ability to sync multiple sequence modules together. So we'll have a go at that in a minute. What else have we got here? Sequence length. So it doesn't have to be 8 steps. It could be anything from 8 all the way down to just 1. So I'm going to go with 4 just to start off with, because I'm going to have to tune these to something that sounds okay, and I don't want to waste your time and bore you with this. But I'm going to take the pitch lane output and put it into one of my pitch inputs here, and I'm going to take the gate, which is this trigger row here, and pass that in as well. So now, actually, I'm going to move this up here. You can turn off all these cables so you can't see them. How do you do that? Like that. There you go. Cables are invisible now. Isn't that cool? And then when you hover over the module, they come back again, so you can edit. It's very cool. I like this voltage modular thing. Anyway, let's just try and set up a little sequence that kind of sounds okay. Let me put my headphones on. So we're going to kick it off. Just start it. We're going to have to turn on these triggers. Otherwise it's not going to sound. Let's turn them all up. Oh, it's a bit fast, isn't it? Okay, I'll start mucking about with the pitches.